Professor Xylith Brightwing adjusted her chromatic scales with a gentle flutter, causing them to shimmer in various shades of professional anxiety. As the most distinguished xenobiology professor at the Galactic University of Advanced Studies, she had organized countless groundbreaking events, but today promised to be special, and not necessarily in a good way. "Computer," she chirped, her beak like mandibles clicking rhythmically. "Display the class roster for today's companion species symposium." The holographic display materialized before her compound eyes, showing the diverse list of students from across the galaxy who would be participating in this unprecedented event. Her antenna twitched nervously as she spotted the 3 human names among the more familiar species designations. "By the sacred nebulae," she muttered, her scales shifting to a concerned shade of violet. What was the board thinking when they approved this? Humans, from Earth, bringing their companion species. The very thought made her outer membrane quiver. She had read the preliminary reports about Earth's wildlife, of course. Every xenobiologist worth their crystalline data storage unit had studied that terrifying death world since humans had joined the Galactic Federation. A planet where approximately 90% of the fauna could be classified as predatory, where even the herbivores had evolved to be aggressive due to constant survival pressure. Professor Brightwing pulled up the safety protocols on her datapad for the 7th time that morning. The force field generators had been triple-checked, the emergency medical station was fully stocked, and the panic buttons had been installed at every desk. She had even requested a specialized containment unit from the Galactic Zoo, just in case. "It will be fine," she reassured herself, mandibles clicking in what she hoped was a confident pattern. "This is a controlled environment. Besides, humans keep insisting their companion species are what's that word they use? Ah, yes, domesticated." The classroom's automatic sanitization system hummed soothingly in the background as she began arranging the specially reinforced observation pods. Each pod was designed to protect the more physically vulnerable species among her students while still allowing them to participate in the presentations. A message flickered across her neural interface: student arrival estimated in 15 standard minutes. Professor Brightwing's scales rippled with determination as she straightened her academic robes. This event would make history, hopefully not as a cautionary tale. The university board had emphasized the importance of cultural exchange and understanding between species. And what better way to understand a species than through their choice of companions? Still, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps they should have started with something simpler, like a study of human bacterial cultures, or maybe their fascinating habit of consuming ethanol for pleasure. Anything but this. "Computer, activate all safety protocols," she commanded, watching as subtle energy fields shimmed into place around the room. "And keep the emergency evacuation routes highlighted, please." As her first students began floating, walking, and in some cases oozing into the classroom, Professor Brightwing tried to project an air of academic confidence. After all, how dangerous could these human pets really be? The first human to enter was Maya Steele, her dark skin contrasting beautifully with her bright orange environmental suit. Professor Brightwing noted with mild horror that she was carrying what appeared to be a large, covered containment unit. The girl's confident stride and easy smile did nothing to calm the professor's rapidly color-shifting scales. Behind Maya came Rex Patterson, a tall, broad-shouldered specimen with striking red hair and a carrying case that seemed to wait. Was it moving? Professor Brightwing's antennae twisted themselves into anxious knots as she watched him choose a seat near the front. Luna Drake was the last human to arrive, her silver-white hair pulled back in complex braids. She handled her transport unit with such gentle care that several of the gaseous form students condensed slightly in curiosity. "Welcome, welcome," Professor Brightwing announced, her voice modulator carefully adjusted to project calm authority. "Please take your designated seats according to atmospheric requirements." The non-human students were already clustering as far from the humans as politeness would allow. Blixnack, a colony mind composed of thousands of tiny crystalline organisms, had actually split into 2 smaller groups to maintain maximum distance from both sides of the room. "Now then," Professor Brightwing continued, pretending not to notice how Zizite, her best methane-breathing student, had engaged their personal shield bubble. "Today marks a historic occasion in our Xenobiology Advanced Studies program. For the first time, we will be examining companion species from multiple worlds, including Earth." The room temperature dropped several degrees as various species engaged their cooling systems to manage their stress responses. A Venusian student actually began to solidify, which only happened in cases of extreme anxiety. Maya Steele raised her hand, that unnerving human smile still plastered across her face. "Professor, should we introduce ourselves and our companions now?" "Ah, yes, well," Professor Brightwing's scales cycled through 7 different shades of nervous before settling on a professional pale blue. "Perhaps we should start with some of our, shall we say, more traditional companion species first." A collective wave of relief washed through the non-human students. G. Lorp, a sentient protoplasm from the Andromeda galaxy, proudly floated forward with their companion, a photonic crystal that emitted soothing light patterns. 3 more students presented their companions a quantum probability cloud that told amusing jokes, a miniature gravity well that sang harmonic frequencies, and a collection of magnetic fields that formed pleasing shapes. Finally, inevitably, it was time. Professor Brightwing's voice modulator betrayed a slight tremor as she spoke. "And now we shall observe the companion species chosen by our human students." Luna Drake stood first, her transport unit emitting a sound that made several students extend their emergency appendages. "I'd be happy to start," she said, reaching for the unit's cover. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet." Professor Brightwing's scales blanched completely white as she noticed something alarming. The safety force field around Luna's area was registering mass readings far larger than what had been listed in the documentation. What exactly was in that container? The entire class held their various forms of breath, sensory organs fixed on Luna's hands as she began to lift the cover. Professor Brightwing's talon hovered over the emergency evacuation button, ready for whatever horror was about to emerge from Earth's evolutionary nightmare. Before Luna could complete her reveal, Maya Steele suddenly jumped up, her containment unit rattling. "Professor, I apologize for interrupting, but Storm is getting anxious. Would it be okay if I went first? He really doesn't like being cooped up." The word anxious triggered immediate chaos. 3 crystalline students vibrated at frequencies that nearly shattered their desk. G. Lorp divided into defensive droplets, each one trembling independently. Professor Brightwing's scales flashed warning patterns. "Your documentation listed the specimen as an it." "Oh, sorry about that," Maya said, already unlatching her container. "Storm's definitely a he. Aren't you, boy?" "Yes, you are." The entire class watched in horror as Maya spoke to her containment unit in that sing-song voice humans sometimes used. Even more terrifying was the deep, rumbling response that emerged from within. "Woof." Zed's methane bubble expanded so rapidly they nearly hit the ceiling. The Venusian student completely solidified into a temporary statue. Blixnack's 1,000 components scattered like a startled school of fish, only their shared consciousness keeping them from fleeing the room entirely. And then Maya opened the container. A massive form of rippling muscle and thick fur bounded out, powerful jaws parting to reveal rows of gleaming white fangs. The creature's ears stood erect, swiveling like biological radar dishes as it surveyed the room with keen intelligence. Its tail, a powerful appendage clearly evolved for balance during high-speed pursuit, wagged back and forth with predatory enthusiasm. "Everyone, this is Storm," Maya announced proudly. "He's a German Shepherd, one of Earth's most popular companion species." Professor Brightwing's educational training warred with her survival instincts as she observed the creature's obvious weapons: claws designed for traction during pursuit, a chest built for endurance hunting, legs clearly adapted for chasing down prey, and those teeth. Those absolutely terrifying teeth. How her voice modulator squeaked. She reset it and tried again. How exactly did this species become a companion? "Oh, humans have been working with dogs for thousands of years," Maya explained, scratching behind Storm's ears. The massive predator leaned into her touch, causing several students to emit their species equivalent of a gasp. "They helped us hunt, protected our settlements, and eventually became our best friends." "Helped you hunt?" Professor Brightwing's scales were cycling through colors so rapidly she was starting to feel dizzy. "Absolutely. Storm here comes from a long line of working dogs. His ancestors helped human law enforcement, searched for lost people, and even participated in military operations." The word military caused such panic that the emergency containment fields activated automatically. Storm, noticing the shimmer of energy, tilted his head curiously and let out another woof. Lorp, who had just managed to reform into a single mass, promptly split into even smaller droplets than before. But don't worry, Maya continued cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the terror she was causing. Storm's a total sweetheart. Want to see some tricks? Storm said. The massive predator immediately planted its haunches on the ground, eyes fixed attentively on Maya. Several students flinched at the display of intelligent obedience. Now, shake. Storm raised one massive paw toward Maya. The sight of those claws extending in a human's direction caused Professor Brightwing to almost activate the emergency evacuation protocol. But then something even more terrifying happened. Maya actually took the paw in her hand and shook it. Good boy. Now, roll over. The entire class watched in fascinated horror as the apex predator willingly exposed its vital organs, rolling onto its back. Even more shocking, Maya bent down and began rubbing the creature's belly, causing one of its back legs to twitch rhythmically. As you can see, Maya said, addressing the class while continuing to scratch the clearly euphoric predator, dogs have developed an incredible bond with humans. They can read our emotions, understand complex commands, and show genuine affection. Professor Brightwing's scientific curiosity finally overcame her terror. This level of interspecies cooperation is unprecedented. But surely such a powerful predator must be difficult to control. Control? Oh no, Storm's family. Here, would anyone like to pet him? The resulting silence was broken only by the sound of the Venusian student cracking slightly as they tried to become even more solid than was physically possible. Storm, perhaps sensing the tension, rolled back onto his feet and gave a full-body shake that rippled through his powerful muscles. Then, to everyone's horror, he began walking toward Professor Brightwing's desk, nose twitching as he investigated this new scent. The professor's scales went completely transparent, a defense mechanism she didn't even know she possessed. Just as Professor Brightwing was beginning to accept that perhaps Storm wasn't going to devour her whole, Luna Drake cleared her throat. Professor, I believe it's my turn now. My companion is a bit different. Different. Professor Brightwing's scales regained just enough color to show concern. Different from that, she gestured toward Storm, who had settled at Maya's feet, tongue lolling out in what she desperately hoped was a non-threatening manner. Oh yes, Luna said, approaching her transport unit. While dogs were bred specifically to work with humans, cats. Well, cats chose us. The container's cover slid back, revealing a massive creature with long, silvery fur and eyes that seemed to glow with ancient wisdom. Or possibly murder. Professor Brightwing couldn't quite tell the difference. This is Phantom, Luna announced as the Maine Coon cat emerged with elegant grace. He's what we call a Maine Coon, one of the largest domestic cat breeds. The class watched in stunned silence as Phantom surveyed the room with casual disdain, his tail moving in slow, hypnotic swishes. Several of the more mathematically inclined students began calculating the physics of how such a small creature could move with such liquid grace. Fascinating, Professor Brightwing managed to say, her scientific curiosity once again overriding her survival instinct. Its movement patterns suggest highly evolved predatory capabilities. Oh yes, Luna agreed cheerfully. Cats are what we call perfect predators. They can see in near darkness, hear frequencies humans can't detect, and their whiskers can sense air movements from potential prey. Lorp, who had finally reformed after the dog incident, immediately separated into defensive positions again. The Venusian student, still solid from earlier, began to develop stress fractures. But surely, Professor Brightwing's voice modulator cracked slightly. Surely you don't mean it still hunts. Phantom chose that moment to fix his gaze on Blixnack's scattered crystalline forms. His pupils dilated into perfect black circles. Well, technically all cats still hunt, Luna explained, seemingly oblivious to the way Phantom's muscles were tensing. They're obligate carnivores. Even though we feed them, they maintain their hunting instincts. Some scientists think they actually taught themselves to meow specifically to communicate with humans. Self-modified vocalizations to manipulate a sapient species. Professor Brightwing's antenna twisted in shock. That suggests an alarming level of intelligence. Watch this, Luna said proudly. Phantom, can you say hello? The massive cat turned its attention away from the terrified students and let out a sound that made everyone's universal translators glitch. Emeror. By the sacred nebulae, Professor Brightwing whispered. It's developed specialized interspecies communication protocols. Phantom, apparently satisfied with the chaos he'd caused, began grooming himself. The sight of his rough tongue, clearly designed for stripping flesh from bone, caused several students to engage their emergency shields. But here's the really interesting part, Luna continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Cats never fully domesticated like dogs did. They just decided humans were useful and moved in with us. They're basically still wild animals who choose to live with us because they want to. The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the sound of the Venusian student's stress fractures spreading. You mean to tell me Professor Brightwing's scales shifted to a shade of disbelief previously unknown to chromatic science, that humans willingly share their dwellings with an undomesticated predator that could decide to leave at any time? Oh yes. In fact, some studies suggest that cats only stick around because they've figured out that humans are useful for food and affection. They're basically tiny tigers that have decided to be our roommates. Phantom, as if to demonstrate this point, suddenly leaped onto Professor Brightwing's desk with impossible grace. The professor's scales went transparent again as the cat began to purr, a sound that her sensors indicated was at almost exactly the frequency known to affect cellular repair in human tissue. "It's using sonic manipulation," she squeaked, her mandibles clicking rapidly in distress. "That means he likes you," Luna beamed. "Would you like to pet him?" Before the professor could decline, Phantom made the decision for her by headbutting her hand and rubbing against it, marking her with scent glands that her sensors indicated contained complex pheromonal markers. It's claiming me as territory," Professor Brightwing realized with horror. The class watched in fascinated terror as their respected professor was systematically claimed by Earth's most efficient predator. Phantom, having finished marking the professor, settled regally on her desk and began to purr louder. "You know," Luna added conversationally, "some people think cats actually domesticated themselves because they figured out humans were useful for hunting larger prey together. There's evidence they started living with us during our agricultural period to hunt the rodents attracted to our grain storage." Professor Brightwing's scales, which had just begun to return to their normal color, blanched again. "You mean to tell me they formed a strategic hunting alliance with humans?" "Exactly. Isn't evolution amazing?" Just as the class was beginning to adjust to the presence of a self-domesticated predator and a military-grade canine, Rex Patterson stood up. His containment unit had been suspiciously quiet all this time, which should have been the first warning sign. Professor Rex said with a grin that made several students' survival instincts scream in protest, "I think it's time to meet Noodle." "Noodle," Professor Brightwing repeated hopefully. Perhaps this one would be some kind of harmless earth vegetation. The name certainly suggested. Her hope died as Rex opened his container and gently lifted out a long, muscular form covered in beautifully patterned scales. Several students immediately engaged their emergency propulsion systems. "This is Noodle, my ball python," Rex announced proudly. "Don't worry, she's super friendly." The Venusian student, who had just begun to liquefy again, promptly re-solidified with an audible crack. Blixnack's crystalline components vibrated at such a high frequency that they began to emit a high-pitched whine. That Professor Brightwing's voice modulator failed completely for a moment. "That is a limbless carnivorous reptile, a constrictor. An ambush predator that kills by crushing its prey." "Well, yes," Rex admitted, as Noodle coiled contentedly around his arm. "But ball pythons are actually one of the most docile snake species. They're known as the puppies of the snake world." Puppies, Professor Brightwing's scales cycled through colors so rapidly she began to strobe. "You named a crushing predator after both your word for infant canines and a food item." Zezite's methane bubble had expanded so much they were now pressed against the ceiling, trying desperately to phase through it. G-Lorp had completely given up on maintaining a unified form and was now just a fine mist of protoplasm hanging in the air. "Would you like to see how she eats?" Rex offered enthusiastically. "I brought some frozen mice that we can thaw." The word mice was apparently the final straw. The Venusian student shattered into exactly 1,247 perfectly crystalline pieces, each one still somehow radiating pure terror. "Absolutely not," Professor Brightwing finally found her authoritative voice. "There will be no feeding demonstrations of any kind." "But it's really educational," Rex protested. while Noodle investigated her surroundings with flickering tongue. Did you know that snakes can unhinge their jaws to swallow prey whole, and their bodies can actually create enzymes that dissolve? This is a xenobiology classroom, not a horror simulation. Professor Brightwing's scales had achieved a new color that would later be added to the universal spectrum under the classification absolute panic. Storm, interested in the new creature, approached to sniff at Noodle. The sight of Earth's two apex predators investigating each other caused several students to initiate their species equivalent of fainting. Phantom, not to be left out, leaped down from the professor's desk to observe the interaction, creating a triangle of Deathworld predators that would feature in the nightmares of everyone present for years to come. You know, Luna commented thoughtfully, I think this really demonstrates why Earth needed to be reclassified in the galactic database. Calling it just a death world doesn't quite capture the complexity of our ecosystem. Complexity. Professor Brightwing's antennae curled in disbelief. You have turned 3 different types of predators into companion animals. The statistical probability of that occurring naturally is. Oh, these aren't even our most unusual pets, Maya chimed in. Some humans keep spiders or scorpions, or even something called a honey badger, though that's really not recommended. The mere mention of additional Death World companions caused the classroom's emergency containment fields to activate automatically. Even the AI system had apparently decided enough was enough. But think about the educational value, Rex argued, while Noodle explored his shoulders like a living scarf. Earth's ability to produce such diverse predatory species and humanity's success in forming symbiotic relationships with them suggests incredible adaptability on both sides. It's a perfect example of convergent evolution. Professor Brightwing had to admit, despite her terror, that he had a point. The fact that humans had managed to form beneficial relationships with multiple apex predators was unprecedented in galactic history. Most civilized species had evolved specifically to avoid predators, not befriend them. Perhaps, she said carefully, her scales settling into a thoughtful shade of blue, we should consider revising our understanding of predator-prey relationships in light of Earth's unique approach. At that moment, Noodle yawned, displaying rows of curved teeth designed for gripping prey. The Venusian student's scattered pieces somehow managed to scoot further away, despite being inanimate. After all, Professor Brightwing continued, watching as Storm gently nosed at Noodle while Phantom observed with regal indifference. Any species that can turn multiple types of predators into companions clearly deserves further study, though perhaps next time we should start with something simpler, like those Earth creatures called hamsters. The humans exchanged knowing looks but wisely decided not to mention anything about hamster cannibalism. Some things they agreed silently. The galaxy wasn't ready to know. As the initial shock began to wear off, Professor Brightwing noticed something remarkable. Storm had settled down next to Rex, watching Noodle with friendly curiosity. Phantom had claimed a spot on Maya's desk, grooming himself while keeping one eye on the proceedings. The 3 predators, despite their vastly different evolutionary paths, seemed completely at ease with each other and their human companions. Remarkable, she muttered, her scales shifting to the deep purple of scientific discovery. The predator-prey dynamics have been completely overwritten by social bonding. The surviving students, those who hadn't fled or dissociated into their component particles, began to emerge from their protective shields. Even Xylit cautiously lowered their methane bubble from the ceiling. Humans, Professor Brightwing announced, her voice modulator steady with newfound confidence. Please explain how you achieved these interspecies bonds. Well, Maya began while Storm rested his head on her lap. It's different for each species. Dogs evolved alongside us, learning to read our emotions and body language. They actually developed special muscles in their faces just to communicate with humans better. Communication adaptations. Professor Brightwing's antennae perked up. Fascinating. And the feline. Luna scratched Phantom's ears, earning a loud purr that made several students vibrate in sympathy. Cats learned that humans would provide food and shelter in exchange for hunting pests and providing companionship. They basically negotiated a mutually beneficial arrangement. A natural evolution of symbiosis. Professor Brightwing's scales flickered with excitement. And the serpent. Snakes like Noodle, Rex explained while his ball python explored his shoulders, taught us to see beauty in creatures very different from ourselves. They help us understand that not everything needs to be warm and furry to be worthy of care and respect. The professor's compound eyes widened as understanding dawned. This isn't just about companionship, is it? This is about humanity's unique ability to form connections with species that most would consider threats. The remaining students began to shift from terror to curiosity. G-Lorp's scattered droplets slowly reformed into a semblance of their usual shape. The Venusian students' pieces stopped trying to escape through the floor vents. Perhaps Professor Brightwing continued, her scales now shimmering with academic enthusiasm. Earth's classification as a death world has caused us to overlook something crucial. The very conditions that created such dangerous species also created a species capable of forming bonds with them. That's right, Maya nodded. Earth's harsh conditions didn't just make us tough. They taught us to adapt, to understand, to connect. Every pet here represents a different kind of relationship, a different way of bridging the gap between species. The professor's antennae quivered with excitement as she began recording her observations. This changes everything we thought we knew about interspecies relationships. The implications for xenobiology are enormous. 2 standard galactic weeks later, Professor Brightwing stood before the university board, her scales glowing with pride as she presented her findings. In conclusion, she announced, I recommend not only continuing the companion species program but expanding it to include regular interactions with Earth's domesticated predators. The psychological insights alone are invaluable to our understanding of human cognitive development. The board members shuffled their various appendages nervously. And the safety concerns, asked the chair being. Already addressed, Professor Brightwing chirped confidently. We've installed specialized containment fields, emergency exits, and trauma counselors for more sensitive species. Though I must note that the therapy costs for our Venusian students' reassembly were quite reasonable. The new policies were approved unanimously, though several board members abstained by temporarily evolving into non-sentient forms to avoid the vote. As Professor Brightwing left the meeting, she passed the newly installed Earth Animal Interaction Laboratory, where Maya was demonstrating how to play fetch with Storm. A group of braver students watched from behind reinforced observation shields, their various sensory organs wide with fascination. In the adjacent room, Luna was explaining to a mesmerized audience how cats had apparently evolved their purring frequency to match human healing vibrations. Phantom sat regally on a floating platform, occasionally gracing selected students with his presence. Even Rex had found an enthusiastic following among the university's physics department, who were particularly fascinated by how Noodle could move without limbs, though the professor noted they only observed from a very, very safe distance. Yes, Professor Brightwing thought as her scales shifted to a satisfied golden hue, the galaxy's understanding of humanity was evolving. Perhaps their classification as Deathworlders had been too simplistic. Any species that could turn apex predators into cuddle companions clearly deserved a category of their own. As she reached her office, she found a note from the maintenance department warning multiple small furry creatures detected in the ventilation system. Humans claim they are escaped hamsters. Containment teams refuse to approach. Please advise. Professor Brightwing's scales turned a pale shade of resignation as she reached for her communication device. Some mysteries of Earth's companion species, she decided, were better left for next semester's class. Though she did make a mental note to ask the humans about something called a tardigrade that she'd read about. After all, how dangerous could a microscopic creature be? The sound of her Venusian student shattering again in the distance suggested she might want to wait on that particular revelation.